Ray Ford with FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research Small Business and Industry Assistance Program, also known as CDER SBIA. Thank you for joining us today for our presentation on submitting IND Safety Reports to FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, also known as FAERS. The webinar will be posted in its entirety, both video and audio, on our website within 5 business days. And that website is fda.gov/CDER SBIA webinars. Before we begin, I'd like to cover some details. Slides for today's presentation are available from the right-hand side of your screen where the orange button says Download the Presentation. This activity is eligible for continuing education by SOCRA, RAPS, SQA, and ACRP. Please refer to our website at fda.gov/CDER SBIA for more details. You'll be able to obtain the attendance certificate only upon completion of the survey, which will remain open for 2 weeks. That means it closes on November the 14th. Even if you don't need the certificate, we would appreciate it if you let us know your comments and feedback via the survey. Now for our CE statement. This event will offer 1 continuing education unit for physicians, pharmacists, and nurses. I want to take a moment to share housekeeping about the CE. All faculty are expected to use generic names. If trade names are used, those of several companies should be used rather than that of only a single supporting company. CE faculty are required to disclose to the attendees when products or procedures being discussed are off-label or unlabeled, and any limitations on the information as presented. Our speakers, Planning Committee, and CET have no conflicts of interest to disclose. After this webinar concludes, instructions on how to claim your continuing education will be sent to you via email from cedersbia@fda.hhs.gov. Please note, you have 14 days to claim your CE and attest to your attendance. To outline today's event, this webinar in its entirety will run approximately 1 hour, which includes a Q&A session. Our speakers today include Meredith Chuck, MD, Associate Director for Safety, Office of Hematology and Oncology Products, CDER, and Saranjan Day, MS, MBA, Deputy Director, Regulatory Science Staff, Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, CDER. Welcome, Dr. Chuck.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for everybody for joining. We are looking forward to sharing information about our new program for submitting IND Safety Reports to FAERS and some of the recently published guidances and technical specification documents. So just to start today, the agenda will include a little bit of a background about our IND Safety Reports and the current process. Then we'll go into our implementation plans, including describing the new process and some of the requirements and implementation. Talk a little bit about how that data flow will be in the new process. Discuss the types of IND Safety Reports that will be submitted to FAERS, and then focus on a few key data elements that are unique for IND Safety Reports using the ICH E2B data standard. We'll follow up with some case examples for some of those more important data elements, and then I will turn it over to Saranjan Day to talk about some of the more technical aspects of the routing mechanisms and some new submission pathways that we have set up for the submission of IND Safety Reports to FAERS. So just to review, all sponsors who conduct clinical trials under an IND are required to submit IND Safety Reports per our regulations for a number of different types of events. These IND Safety Reports for sponsors of commercial INDs are currently submitted in ECTD format, generally as PDFs, and this is a very inefficient and labor-intensive process to both track and review, and can make safety signal detection and tracking very inefficient. The new process, we will have sponsors submitting these IND Safety Reports as XML files to FAERS using the ICH E2B data standard. And this will allow us to receive standard data elements, and we'll be able to use some data visualization and analytic tools for review and tracking. This is also leveraging existing processes that are used in the post-market reporting, such as the data standard, the ICH E2B data standard, and also FDA submission pathways such as the Gateway and the Safety Reporting Portal. It also complies with our existing federal regulations surrounding IND Safety Reports, 21 CFR 312.32, So this new process is strictly a change in the method of submission. So this is really the how to submit. The what to submit, the types of events that qualify for IND safety reports are not changing. And although I will refer to some of the content of these reports, that is really beyond the scope of this webinar, and I'll refer you back to some of the guidances that describe the content of the submission. This webinar will really focus on the new process for how to submit these reports to FDA into FAERS. So FDA did several pilots of this process starting a number of years ago. Essentially, the first phase was to ensure that we were able to take this data that we had traditionally been receiving in MedWatch forms and convert that data into E2B format to FAERS. We then worked with a number of commercial sponsors to further develop some of the technical specifications, specifically around the particular data elements in E2B that are required for IND safety reports. IND safety reports have different data elements and different regulatory requirements than for the post-market, so we worked with this part of the pilot to develop some of those specifications. And then more recently, we conducted an end-to-end pilot, which really looked at the submission process from the sponsor standpoint up to the point where reviewers will be able to view this data in our current FDA systems. A little bit about the requirements and the timelines. So this will be a required change in format for sponsors of commercial INDs, and this is being done under 745A of the FD&C Act. And as you will note in guidance that was published just this week, there is a draft binding guidance that describes this required change. So essentially, sponsors of commercial INDs, once this requirement is in effect, will be required to submit certain IND safety reports to FAERS. There are two options currently for submission through the Electronic Submissions Gateway, or ESG, and also there's a web-based version for sponsors who don't have the database-to-database capabilities required for ESG. They can then use the safety reporting portal. The requirement for non-commercial INDs will go into effect 24 months after the publication of the final guidance. So again, we recently published draft guidance this past week. That will be open for comment, and final guidance will be published following review of those comments. However, we will begin a voluntary submission process and will encourage sponsors of all INDs to participate in the voluntary submission process once that is announced. But important to note that we are not currently accepting IND safety reports to FAERS, and we will announce when that voluntary submission process will begin. Talking about the communication plan for this required change, as I mentioned, just this past week, there have been a number of guidances that have been published. The first is providing regulatory submissions in electronic format, IND safety reports. That is the guidance, that draft binding guidance that describes the regulatory requirement for sponsors. The next one is electronic submission of IND safety reports, a technical conformance guide. That is giving more information about the implementation of that required process. And then next, there is an updated guidance, the revised specifications for preparing and submitting electronic ICSRs and ICSR attachments. That is the current guidance that's in use for post-market reporting, and that's simply been updated with elements for IND safety reporting to provide additional information. The links for those guidances are on the slides, and the FAERS website has been recently updated with links to these guidance as well, and the technical specification documents related to the submission of IND safety reports. There'll be a lot of other FDA communications around the time when this voluntary submission process begins. Sorry about that, the button's a little buggy. The data flow for IND safety reports, just to give a little bit of an overview. So with the new process, the sponsor will generate an IND safety report from their pharmacovigilance system as an XML file using the E2B data standard. And again, these will be for events that are serious, unexpected, and suspected to be related to the drug. So this is our current regulatory requirements, no change in the what, this is just the how. The sponsors will then submit those XML files through the gateway, and those files will then be processed in FAERS. The files will then be stored and have some analytic capabilities for new tools that we are deploying, and that will be how the reviewers will then review and track this information. Because both, when the new process begins, both IND safety reports and post-market safety reports will be housed in FAERS, and because the post-market safety reports are published on a quarterly abstract and available on a public dashboard, the IND safety reports will not be subject to publication, so will not be made public. As an additional, as a check so that those reports will be kept separate in our internal databases and will not be made separately, we have created a separate submission path for IND safety reports, and Saranjan will go into a little bit more of the details later about those two submission paths, but I'm just going to briefly mention that there are new header attributes and routing IDs for sponsors who use either AS2 headers or AS2 routing IDs specific for IND safety reports and attachments. And as you will note there, for using AS2 headers for the XML file, that'll be the AIRS underscore pre-market. So the underscore pre-market is the new is the new addition and the new configuration that will be required for submitting IND safety reports. Sponsors that are using routing IDs for the XML file will then use FDA underscore AIRS underscore pre-market. And again, all of this information is contained within the technical specification documents and just meant to be highlighted here. So again, just to reiterate, the two pathway or the extra pathway was created to allow separation of pre-market and post-market safety reports within our database. So it's critical that sponsors understand the difference and submit these IND safety reports to the appropriate pathway. The next, I want to cover the types of IND safety reports and which system these will be submitted to. As I noted before, the requirement is only for certain IND safety reports. The 31232, the regulations that define the types of events that require submission as an IND safety report, describe a number of different events that qualify. The types of IND safety reports that will be submitted to FAERS are those for serious, unexpected, and suspected adverse reactions. Generally speaking, those with individual patient data. Those are the types of events that are designated and fit the criteria for the E2B data standard or the ICSR, where it was developed. The other types of IND safety reports are generally narrative summaries, findings from other studies, preclinical testing, or an increased rate of occurrence of known adverse reactions. Again, these types of reports generally do not contain individual patient data, do not fit the data standard, and should continue to be submitted in eCTD format. I noted the technical specifications that currently in use for post-market that have been updated with information for IND safety reporting. One of the most critical data elements that sponsors who are submitting IND safety reports need to understand is where the IND number goes. So we did not generate any new regional data elements for E2B-R2. So with the current submission, E2B-R2 version, the IND number where the event occurred should be in data element A232. So again, and this is required for processing and routing to the appropriate FDA review division. This new process will not have a cover letter or 1571. They'll be submitted to FAERS, so the IND number where the event occurs is a required element for these reports. The second thing to note on the screen is the IND numbers for cross-reported INDs. So our regulations and our guidance specify that sponsors should submit the IND safety report where the event occurred, but should also submit an IND safety report to all the other INDs evaluating that same suspect product. In the submission to FAERS, multiple reports would create duplicates, which we do not want. So the technical way solution for listing all of these IND numbers is to repeat that block A2 and then use those for the cross-reported INDs. And I'll go into a little bit more information about that with some of the case scenarios. You'll hear this concept a couple of times because it's critical for routing to the appropriate review divisions. Now I want to touch a little bit on some of the critical data elements in the technical specification documents for IND safety reporting. These are excerpts largely from the technical specification documents, although I've removed a lot of the text that's there just to make things a little bit easier to see. So again, as we mentioned, the IND where the event occurred is in the sponsor using the sponsor study number tag. The observed study type lets us know what types of trials or what types of areas that IND safety report was from. We have added 2 new data element values. One is a report from aggregate analysis, which I'll touch on a little bit later how that's used. And then, of course, what I noted before was this cross-reported IND safety report. So for the primary IND, again, the IND where the event occurred, the sponsor would put that IND in A232 and then list what type of study this was seen in, generally a clinical trial, but it could be any of those, a clinical trial, individual patient use, other studies, or report from aggregate analysis. And if there were 5 other INDs that sponsor has looking at that drug, they would then repeat that block with the data element value 5. Other data elements that are somewhat specific and would be needed to accurately process an IND safety report is the report type, which would generally be number 2, a report from study. The study name, since these are largely clinical trial reports, they often will have, and we would request the study name. And the element value for that is the study ID, which is used from the tagging file in ECTD. That would be the same value that's used for ECTD submissions, concatenated with the abbreviated trial name. And the last one on this slide is the fulfill expedited criteria tag. So essentially, IND safety reports are required as either a 15-day or a 7-day report. So sponsors should use element value 1 for 15-day reports, and a new element value was created, number 6, for 7-day reports, because again, 7-day reports are not a requirement for and don't exist in post-market reporting, so that was a new data element value that was created for IND safety reports. In terms of the drug information, again, these are existing fields. Either medicinal product or active substance is required in order to process these reports. As it's in the post-market, there has to be a suspect product. For investigational products, they may not have a medicinal product name or an approved medicinal product name. If an INN or USAN name is available, that should be used. But if that is not available, companies can use the company code if there is no established name. We also recommend the company code for multi-ingredient products, or if the name of the product exceeds the character length. And again, this is noting we're starting with E2BR2. So sponsors need to be cognizant of the character limitations for both medicinal product and active substance in E2BR2. There will be some further information that will be provided about letting FDA know, letting the review divisions know about the naming conventions if there is no INN or USAN name for the suspect product being evaluated under the IND. Causality assessment is another aspect of the regulatory reporting requirements that are highlighted in IND safety reports. So for these reports, again, the requirement is at least one suspect product has to be related to an event. The drug assessment source by the regulations, the requirement is that the assessment is that of the sponsor. The investigator assessment can be in a repeated block for that drug assessment source tag. And for the drug result, our recommendation is to standardize this with a code list value of 1 is suspected and 2 is not suspected. For the narratives, again, since we're starting in E2BR2, there is a character limitation of 20,000 within that case narrative field. Our strong recommendation is that sponsors construct informative narratives that fit within that character limitation. If that is not possible, or there's a required attachment such as an autopsy report or a literature report, those can be submitted as PDF attachments, although the recommendation is to fit as much as possible within that narrative field in that structured element. The sender comment tag and field can be used for the analysis of similar events. And again, all of these are within the technical specifications document, and we were just pulling out a few that were specific for IND safety reporting that may be different from the post-market. So clearly this has benefits to FDA in terms of standardizing the way we receive this data in a format that can be reviewed, analyzed, and tracked more efficiently. But we also believe there are benefits to industry as well in the processing and submission. So these would be direct electronic submissions to FDA from the pharmacovigilance system. There is no requirement for a 1571 or a cover letter. And again, there's no need to send duplicate reports. However, again, we'll note that the cross-reporting requirement does not go away. There's just a technical solution, as I mentioned, about how to list all of the INDs that would be relevant to receive those reports. Again, this is a more comprehensive and structured format than the MedWatch form, and this also provides a format for sponsors that's consistent with post-market submissions and also ex-US submissions. I want to transition to a couple of case scenarios, just two, and these are really focused on more of the important aspects about IND safety reporting that's different from the post-market. So this, again, it sounds like a broken record, but this is critical to ensure that the IND safety reports are routed to the appropriate review divisions. So again, this is to address the cross-reporting. So the primary IND, or the IND where the event occurred, should be in the first block of A2. And then the observed study type would be element value 1, 2, 3, or 4. If the sponsor has 5 other INDs evaluating that same suspect product, they would then repeat block A2 5 more times with only the IND number for those other 5 INDs, and then A233 data element value equals 5. So again, the first primary IND gets data element value 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the observed study type. And then for all the other cross-reported INDs, block A2 is repeated with a data element value of 5. The other case scenario is a report from aggregate analysis. And again, because this new submission process refers to the how to submit and not the what to submit, and the regulatory requirements for the what to submit are beyond the scope of this webinar, but I will refer you back to the regulations and to our technical conformance guide, which points back to the guidances where these are discussed. Essentially, these are reports for which more than one report is required to assess causality. So these are reports where there are likely to be a number of linked reports to say, yes, this is a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the event. So the linked report number tag will link all of those reports that made up this aggregate analysis. The sponsor study number, again, which is required, will be the parent IND, generally speaking, because these may be reports that came from across the development program and involved more than one IND. So the concept of the parent IND is generally the IND under which U.S. investigations was initiated. So that's the first IND that was opened in the U.S. With clinical trials. The observed study type would be that new data element value report from aggregate analysis, and then the patient initial would be aggregate. And again, as is noted in the technical conformance guide, the narrative portion of this report from aggregate analysis is then attached as a PDF. And again, as I mentioned, we have a number of other case scenarios, and the scenarios are discussed in more detail in the specifications for preparing and submitting electronic ICSRs and attachments, which again is the post-market technical specification documents that's been recently updated. The link again is here and is also on the FAERS website, so I encourage sponsors to visit that website and that document for more detailed explanations of these case scenarios. All right, so now we are at the challenge question. So hopefully folks have been paying attention and are able to answer this question successfully. So which of the following are required elements for submission of IND safety reports to FAERS? Is it a suspect product? Is it an IND number? Is it a Form 1571? Or is it both A and B? And again, we're going to pretend we have some audience participation, although we don't actually have some, so I'll give you a minute. And then those of you who guessed D were correct. So a suspect product and an IND number are required for submitting IND safety reports to FAERS. So we do not require a Form 1571. All right, next challenge question. FDA is currently accepting IND safety reports to FAERS. And the answer is false. So please do not currently try to submit IND safety reports to FAERS. The guidance and technical specification documents that were published this week were published so that sponsors can ready their systems and can provide feedback via comments to the docket for those particular guidances. And providing comments to the docket, there are information on the FR notice. All right, challenge question number 3 for those of you really paying attention. So what types of IND safety reports will not be submitted to FAERS? Are these the single events with an event that's uncommon and known to be strongly associated with drug exposure? A. B. One or more occurrences of event that is uncommon with drug but also uncommon in the population? Is it C. An aggregate analysis of events that indicates those events occur more frequently in drug-treated versus non-treated? Or is it findings from animal or in vitro testing? Give everyone a minute. And that would be D. So findings from animal or in vitro testing will not be submitted to FAERS. And again, these are preclinical studies. They do not have individual patient data. They're generally submitted in a narrative format and don't fit the data specifications for E2B format. All right, so we're going to take a brief transition period. I'm going to call Saranjan Day up to provide some more information on the technical aspects of the routing mechanisms. So as we take this transition, I'd ask folks to submit your questions, and here I'll hand it off to Saranjan.
All right, thank you, Meredith. All right, I'm Saranjan Day. I'm with CDER, with Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology. So today I'm going to go over the routing mechanism for submitting the IND reports, or what we call as pre-market report or the post-market report. So setting up the routing controls that dictates where the document is set or sent. So there are two options, and I think many of the sponsors who have been submitting through post-market ICSRs probably know these two options. So let me go over these two options again. The option number 1 is a concept of using AS2 headers. So basically, you set up a header indicating where what this report is about, and then through the gateway then knows where the report needs to end up in. And the second way of submitting is through routing IDs, and these routing IDs can be set up automatically at your end, and then the system could your systems could automatically then send these reports to the appropriate route. And the reason why we are doing this is just to make sure that the pre-market and the post-market reports don't collide, and we all know that post-market reports are something which are also posted publicly, and we want to make sure that the pre-market reports don't fall into that bucket. So how the AS2 headers, what are the values for the AS2 headers? So if any firm is using the AS2 headers, then you have the destination as CDER. You have the attributes which currently these are used for post-market, where you have attribute value as AIRS and for XMLs and AIRS underscore attachments for PDF. Now, when we do IND safety reports, what we did was you still have the destination that remains the same, and the attribute values now is AIRS underscore MKT, which stands for pre-market, and for the attachments you have AIRS attachments pre-market. As you also know that for since these are all submissions, we're talking about E2B R2. We've not gone into R3 yet. These are something where you first submit the XML and then get your acknowledgement and then submit the attachment. So the same method what you do in post-market also applies to pre-market. Now, if a firm or an organization is using the AS2 routing IDs, then the routing IDs for post-market, which we have currently, is FD underscore AIRS and FD underscore AIRS underscore attachments. And for IND, it's going to be FD underscore AIRS underscore pre-market and FDA AIRS attachment pre-market. So for the attachment. So keep in mind that these values are important, and that will determine where your report is actually going to. So just looking at this, if you look at it here, also we are putting more caution into these submissions, where depending on the pre-market or post-market submission, I think one of the questions has already come, and I think I need to mention this here is if you have a post-market study report, then you have to submit 2 reports. And when you submit 2 reports from a sponsor's end, the report numbers probably may be the same. But when it comes to FDA, when you submit 2 reports, one on the pre-market and one on the post-market, based on the active ingredient, which has an NDA and also has an IND, these reports are separated out with the sender report ID, where the post-market report sender report ID stays the same, and to the pre-market report, we in FDA kind of put in a hyphen IND so that we keep it separate. And this separation can only be identified if the reports have been sent by using the appropriate routing IDs, the pre-market route or the post-market route. When the acknowledgement will go out, the acknowledgement will just go out with the original sender report ID that you had sent. You will not even know that we have appended that. But that basically keeps things different. That basically segregates things in our system, and it keeps them totally separated. So there is no confusion between a report which is come from the pre-market and post-market, especially on a post-market study. So with that, I will summarize the presentation today that we went over, where Meredith went over all the information on IND reporting, and I discussed the routing mechanism. So to summarize, the FDA draft guidance and a technical specification document was recently published regarding submission of IND safety reports to FAERS. This is most important, that's why it's bold and underlined. FDA is not currently accepting the IND safety reports to FAERS. The reason why this was again published, it's for you sponsors to start now looking into these guidances and technical specifications, because you'll have to start preparing for this, and the sooner the better. So it's important that you start looking at the guidance and the technical specification, and especially with my experience here in the FDA, many of these questions regarding guidance and technical specifications show up and are asked as as the sponsors start implementing these guidance and technical specifications. So that's the big reason why this has been published. But we are also working, FDA is also working to set up their systems, our systems, so that we can then accept this and do our analysis. So with that, FDA will announce when voluntary submission process will begin, and the requirement will be in effect 2 years after the final guidance. IND specific E2B elements are critical to ensure regulatory requirements are met. As Meredith also talked about, how these reports are routed to the appropriate reviewer. So it's very important that you will understand these data elements, the definition, how these elements are being used, and most important that because this is R2 and we did not introduce any new data elements, we have repurposed some of the data elements. So that's why it is more important to understand that concept of repurpose and how the definition of the data element has been repurposed. So with that, we'll take a short break and review our questions, and we'll be right back with answers. Thank you.
For your questions, we certainly have received a lot, so we will try and address as many as we can. There have been a number of questions along the same theme, so it may not be exactly your question, but we'll try and address the theme that was asked. So a number of questions surrounded, is this a requirement for research INDs as well? So no, the requirement is only for sponsors of commercial INDs. However, we certainly encourage sponsors of all INDs to submit to FAERS, and that's particularly the reason why there are two options, so that sponsors who have the capabilities to do database-to-database submissions or to submit XML files in the E2B format directly can submit through the gateway, and that can be done either with AS2 connections, or that can also be done as a web trader submissions as well for some low-volume submissions. But for those folks who don't have resources to do either of those, there is a web-based option. So that's what the safety reporting portal is what we're encouraging sponsors of non-commercial INDs to use to submit IND safety reports to FAERS. So again, no requirement, but they will be welcome and encouraged to use the same process as soon as we announce that the voluntary submissions will begin. One of the other questions was about how does this CDER process affect CBER, and this affects both centers. So this is for, and this is detailed in the guidance, this is for all IND safety reports to both CDER and CBER will be submitting to FAERS. All of the IND safety reports covered under the guidance that's listed there at the top of your screen. There was a question about R2 versus R3. So we are starting submissions in E2B R2 version, and that is because that is what the post-market reporting for drugs and biologics in CDER is R2. Once we transition to R3 for post-market, we will also transition to R3 for pre-market. So there will be more information coming out about the transition to R3, and once we start accepting R3 for post-market, we'll also accept R3 for pre-market for IND safety reports. There will be a crossover period. There is no implementation time frame for R3, so even once we start accepting R3, we will still accept R2, and there are some backward and forward compatibility documentation out there to assist with that transition process. There is a question about the analysis of similar events, and again, as noted, that would be the second narrative tag. I believe it was B54, so that is where we are recommending the analysis of similar events to be placed. Again, cognizant of character limitations, the hope is that that will fit within existing E2BR2 character limitations. If the amount of information exceeds that, sponsors should start with the structured field and then add the additional information as an attachment. So our E2BR2 allows for attachments. Some questions about CROs submitting IND safety reports on behalf of sponsors and whether or not that has to be the same CRO as it was for ECTD. Transfer of obligations can be for any aspect of regulatory requirements, so CROs can submit on behalf of IND sponsors submitting these IND safety reports to FAERS. The anticipated timing for the voluntary submission, I know we had initially projected it might be this October. However, that is not happening. As we mentioned, we're not currently accepting IND safety reports to FAERS, and we will announce when that voluntary submission process will begin. We don't have a date for that voluntary submission process at this point. Several questions surround IND safety reports for clinical trials not conducted in the U.S., where those would be submitted. And the same process would, currently now those reports would be submitted to the so-called parent IND, or that IND that was opened that initiated U.S. clinical investigations. So the same IND number should be put in the E2B XML file. So ex-U.S. clinical trials, again, if they meet the reporting requirements for an IND safety report, that should be submitted to that parent IND. Generally the IND with the lowest number, and the IND where clinical investigations were opened. The 24-month implementation period, there was several questions surrounding that. So we just published the draft guidance this week. That will be open for comments. I believe there's a 60-day comment period. We will then address those comments and make any revisions as needed, and then we'll publish the final guidance. From the day the final guidance is published, the requirement will then be 2 years from 24 months following the publication of that final guidance. So again, no implementation date, no requirement date at this point, and the voluntary submission date is not likely to align with either of those, but the voluntary submission date will be ahead of the requirement. Also some questions about whether or not duplicate submissions will be required. So once the voluntary submission process, once we announce that that's available, sponsors will only have to submit IND safety reports to FAERS. Part of our pilot process, and several sponsors who were involved in that pilot did duplicate submissions. So they would submit the MedWatch PDF to ECTD and then the XML file to FAERS. Once we, per se, go live, or once this voluntary submission process begins, the regulatory submissions will be sent to FAERS, and there will no longer be a requirement to send these reports to ECTD. So the duplicate submission will only for the purposes of the pilot, so that we could develop the technical specifications and ready our systems. So when we announce that the voluntary submission process begins, sponsors will only have to submit reports to FAERS, and those reports in FAERS will be used for regulatory reporting requirements and will be viewed by our review divisions. Sorry for that short break. We're just gathering some more questions. So if there is a drug being evaluated under an IND that is also a marketed product, and if the event meets criteria for both pre-market and post-market reporting requirements, we do require 2 reports, one for pre-market and one for post-market. So there were a number of questions about this, so I just want to be clear. Because the regulatory reporting requirements are different, they're essentially considered separate reports. So again, if there is a marketed product being evaluated under IND, an event occurs with that product that meets both IND safety reporting requirements and post-market reporting requirements, 2 reports should be submitted to FAERS, one with the IND number, and then one as per usual reporting practices for the NDA or the BLA. And again, there's a number of comments about, or a number of questions about the cross-reporting. So there's really not any changes from the guidance. So the guidance states that the IND where the event occurred, and then all other open INDs for that similar suspect product, for that same suspect product. And again, we just have a technical way of conforming to that requirement with the submission to FAERS. And I'm going to refer you back to both the technical specifications document and the technical conformance guide for more information about how that's done. There's something about there are questions about annual report, IND annual report submissions. This does not at all apply to IND annual report submissions. This is purely IND safety reports. IND annual reports will continue to be submitted per the usual fashion. Test submissions for IND safety reports. So there will be the ability to, once the voluntary submission process begins, sponsors will be able to, and actually I'm going to have Saranjan come and talk a little bit more about the testing for this new process.
All right. So we're back with some more questions. All right. So here is one question. What is the process for follow-up reports? So the way the process of follow-up reports works is it's very important that the safety report ID stays the same, and the safety report ID, when it comes through a gateway and FAERS picks it up, it checks if there is a if the same safety report ID exists in FAERS, it automatically creates a follow-up. If not, it creates an initial report. So it's very important you keep the safety report ID the same. So another question is that additional attachment or PDF could take place directly via the system. So if you're submitting, so as you saw that two methods of submission, right? And one is what we call as the safety reporting portal, and the second way is through the gateway. If you're submitting through the gateway, then you would first submit the XML file, get an acknowledgement, and then submit the PDF document. If you're using the safety reporting portal, this is something I think many of you probably will probably use, is the safety reporting portal, which is a website where you would first register, get a username, password, create an account, let FDA know on what IND and the active ingredient products you're going to be reporting, and then you could directly go and submit through the portal your safety report. The portal also tracks the initial and follow-ups. So it's like any safety system where you create your initial report, you submit. As soon as you hit on the submit, that's your FDA receive date that you have submitted. And now if you have a follow-up, you can open the initial report and create a follow-up out of that. Most of the information gets copied to the follow-up report, and then you add your new information and then submit that report. So, so the safety reporting portal is more a web-based and a little more easier to use people who don't have experience in submitting XMLs via the gateway. There's a question on how will the IND suffix. So this IND suffix is something that FDA will maintain internally. This has nothing to do with the sponsors. And the reason why we are going to be doing this is just to differentiate between a post-market safety report where you're going to be submitting two reports, as Meredith just talked about in her last question. You could have the same safety report ID, and it's very important for FDA to differentiate that between a pre-market and the post-market. That's why FDA will do this. This has nothing to, no impact or nothing to do with the sponsors. All right, so we have another question where, so are there data elements that should be used to link follow-up safety reports to the original report, or should these follow-ups report be only submitted by ECTD to the IND? So we talked about follow-up reports as that if you have a follow-up report and if you're submitting through the gateway, then you please make sure you keep the safety report ID constant. Do not change that, and that will automatically create a follow-up to the original initial report that you had submitted. And if you are on the safety reporting portal, you will see all your submissions that you have done. You will pick the latest submission and say you want to create a follow-up, and then that will automatically create a follow-up report for you. So there was one common question which I saw where it deals with providing templates of the XML files. Yes, we do plan to provide some samples of the XML file for IND, where you will get an idea of how the file looks like, especially when you have link reports for aggregate, how the file will look like when you have the primary IND on which the adverse event occurred versus the cross-reference INDs. And we can will definitely post on the FAERS electronic submission webpage sample files. So should SUSARs which occur in a post-market clinical trial be sent to both pre-market, post-market? You heard the answer from Meredith. Both have to be submitted through the two different routing mechanisms. All right. Let's see. So I'll do one last question before I hand it over to Meredith. The question is that when we sponsor submits two reports, one through the post-market route and one through the pre-market route, maybe because it's a post-market study report, will they be very clear about the two acknowledgements that they'll get? And the answer is yes. The file will actually have, you will actually have two separate acknowledgement files which will come with the appropriate core ID and the message ID, and you will be able to identify the two acknowledgements and appropriately update your safety database. All right, Meredith.
All right, thank you. We'll finish with a couple of last questions. This one asks about linking the aggregate reports, and again, there is a standard E2B field, I believe it's A112, that links reports that are required for the aggregate analysis. Again, our guidance, and I'll point you back to the IND Safety Reporting Guidance, discusses reports from aggregate analysis. Each of those cases that made up that analysis should be submitted, so that is how, via the E2B fields, those individual cases should be linked. There's a question about receiving the non-company comparator used in trials. And the way that the E2B files will be sent is that all of the products that the patient is receiving at the time should be listed in the report. And there is a way to designate whether or not that's a suspect product or a non-suspect product, or whether that concomitant medication should also be listed. So that's standard procedure for E2B XML files. There's a question about if sponsors are currently reporting post-market via the ESG, can they submit IND safety reports versus the web portal? And there's certainly nothing to say that you can't. However, I would encourage that if you already have the capabilities to do post-market reporting through the ESG, that it may be more efficient to do that for IND safety reports as well. But because those reports are not linked, there's nothing to say that you cannot do that. A question about the process that FDA will be using to control that pre-market IND reports will not be posted publicly. And I know that we've touched on this a couple of times, but it's a very important concept. So there are several provisions that we've done to prevent to keep these reports separate and prevent the IND safety reports from being posted publicly. And the most important one is really the two submission paths. And the second one are a number of internal checks by which we will append the IND to the safety report ID number, and also a number of secondary checks to ensure that they are not posted publicly. However, we'd like to reiterate that the main onus is on the sponsor, and the creation of those two submission pathways was designed so that there was a completely separate submission pathway for IND safety reports versus post-market. And the final question is that will follow-ups replace the initial report in the database? And the answer is no. So the convention for an E2B XML submission is that each individual report is maintained within the systems. Although regular E2B conventions in terms of what information should be submitted is followed for IND and for post-market safety reports, but FDA will keep a record of each individual report that was submitted. So I'd like to thank everybody for their participation and questions, and we look forward to any other comments you have, and I will turn it back to Ray.
Thank you to our speakers for your very informative and timely talk, and also for responding for the questions that came in. A few closing reminders. This activity is eligible for 1 unit of CME, CNE, and CPE. After the webinar, you'll receive a separate email providing you with instructions and completion codes. This activity is also eligible for continuing education by SOPRA, RAPS, SQA, and ACRP. Please refer to our website at fda.gov/CDER for more details. You'll be able to obtain the attendance certificate only upon completion of the survey, which will remain open for 2 weeks. Let us know your comments and feedbacks via this survey. This will provide us with ideas for future improvements. If your question was not answered, please resend to cdera@fda.hhs.gov. On behalf of CDER Small Business and Industry Assistance, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation and found it helpful. We look forward to your presence at future webinars, which will be advertised on our website at fda.gov/CDER SBIA webinars.